better. I want to brighten you up a little bit now.
Yeah, the monitor looks brighter now.
Tommy.
Soldier boy, oh my little soldier boy, I'll be true to you, love, my heart will follow.
Good afternoon, Hartford, and welcome on the last day of July, July 31st, 2018, to the program Voices of Veterans, put on with the help of Steve Fournier, a veteran, myself, Dave Yano, and the help of Hartford Public Access Television, which has made its equipment, its studios, and its time available to us, Hartford residents, so that we can broadcast a program other than the usual television shows that one is watching on cable access or regular stations. This is not a reality show, so to speak. This is just a real show. What we do here is we invite veterans to come on. I've had one guest who is a former Marine and an Afghan vet on, and I hope in the future to have a few more guests on so that they can tell their part of the story. But a lot of what I'm doing is reading from books written by veterans, about veterans, and a lot of the issues that veterans are struggling with today in today's United States of America. But before we get into the current readings that I'm going to be doing, I'm going to do a little PSA, which is a public service announcement. Again, I'm going to encourage people to make sure they vote in the Democratic and Republican primaries, which are coming up on August 14th. We're having a lot of primaries because there are a lot of new people currently running for office across the state and in the city of Hartford. We have a candidate running in the 3rd District, Gannon Long, who's running with the support of the Working Families Party and Independent Democrats for state representative in the 3rd District from Hartford. And she's 35 years old. She's been very active in gay and immigration, and also active in supporting people in the city. She's a Hartford High graduate. She went to school with my daughters. And I would encourage you to support her and also to support any of the new people who are running for office throughout the state of Connecticut and the city of Hartford. As far as how your vote matters, to encourage you to vote, I'm just going to let you know that the vote is something that people died for, people actively fought for, and some of us even went and fought before we were even able to vote. For instance, myself, I enlisted in the United States Army in 1969 at the age of 18. I was regular Army, RA all the way. I volunteered for and went to Vietnam as a combat medic with the 23rd Infantry Division. I served there until 1971, and when I came home, they still had just barely talking about changing the law, but I was in Vietnam before I could vote. That's how significant the vote is. People like us are willing to die for the vote before we even had it. Now 18-year-olds have the vote, which is as it should be. So that's my public service announcement about the advocacy for voting and why you should definitely go out there and exercise your right at the polls. That's the only way we're going to get new people in, is to vote in young people from the next generation, to try to get us out of the mess that we've somehow gotten ourselves into. One of the things I want to talk about, there's been a whole slew of articles and newspapers and magazine reporting and television reporting on the opioid epidemic, which is going through the country at the moment. But that epidemic, so to speak, is nothing new. And a lot of these things have followed the course of a current war or a past war that was going on. In fact, as far back as the Civil War, veterans were given morphine for their pain and loss of limbs, and a lot of them became addicted to the morphine, and it was something called soldier sickness, which was a lot of veterans at the Civil War ended up being addicted to morphine, trying to assuage the physical pain plus the psychological, spiritual pain that they suffered from the massive casualties and the battlefield horrors that they endured. And all through all the wars that have followed us throughout our history, there's been a following epidemic and use of drug use. When I was in Vietnam, it became apparent to me that heroin was widely available to the troops on the ground in Vietnam. And I recently bought a book from the library, which I encouraged them to buy. It's called The Politics of Heroin, CIA Complicity in the Global Drug War, written by Alfred W. McCoy, who was a journalist who traveled to Vietnam and traveled to what was known as the triangle up there, where in Laos and China, Cambodia, and in Burma and Thailand, where a lot of the opium was grown and processed into opioid base and then sent to Cholon and Saigon, where the Chinese chemists put together number 4 heroin, which addicted a lot of United States troops. I'm going to read you a little bit from the book to give you an idea of just how much of that was going on. The sudden spread of heroin addiction among the GIs in 1970 was the most important development in Southeast Asian narcotics traffic since the region attained self-sufficiency in opium production along the late 1950s. By 1968-69, which was the year I was enlisting in the Army, the Golden Triangle region was harvesting close to 1,000 tons of raw opium annually, substantial quantities of narcotics in Hong Kong, both for local consumption and for export to the United States. Although large amounts of chunky, low-grade number 3 heroin were being produced in Bangkok and the Golden Triangle for the local market, there were no laboratories anywhere in Southeast Asia capable of producing the fine-grained 80 to 90% pure number 4 heroin. However, in late 69 and early 1970, Golden Triangle laboratories added the final dangerous ether precipitation process and converted to production of number 4 heroin. Many of the master chemists who supervised the conversion were Chinese, brought in specially from Hong Kong. In a June 1971 report, the CIA said that conversion from number 3 to number 4 heroin production in the Golden Triangle appears due to the sudden increase in demand by a large and relatively affluent market in South Vietnam. By mid-April of 71, demand for number 4 heroin in both Vietnam and the United States had increased so quickly that the wholesale price for a kilo jumped to $1,780 from $1,240 the previous September. Once large quantities of heroin became available to American GIs in Vietnam, heroin addiction spread like a plague. Previously unavailable in South Vietnam, suddenly number 4 was everywhere. 14-year-old girls were selling heroin at roadside stands on the main highway from Saigon to the U.S. Army base at Long Binh. Saigon street peddlers stuffed plastic vials of 95% pure heroin into the pockets of GIs as they strolled through downtown Saigon. And mamasans, or Vietnamese barracks maids, started carrying a few vials to work for sale to on-duty GIs. With this kind of aggressive sales campaign, the results were predictable. In September of 1970, Army medical officers questioned 3,103 soldiers of the Americal Division and discovered that 11.9% had tried heroin since they arrived in Vietnam, and 6.6% were still using it on a regular basis. In November, a U.S. engineering battalion in the Mekong Delta reported that 14% of its troops were on heroin. By mid-1971, the U.S. Army medical officers were estimating that about 10 to 15%, or 25,000 to 27,000 of the lower-ranking enlisted men serving in Vietnam were heroin users. I can absolutely, truthfully say to you that you should double those numbers as far as what you're looking, as far as what this guy is reporting. At base after base was overrun by these armies of heroin pushers with their identical plastic vials. GI and officers alike started asking themselves, why was this happening? Who was behind the heroin plague? The North Vietnamese were frequently blamed, and wild rumors started floating around U.S. installations about heroin factories in Hanoi, truck convoys rumbling down the Ho Chi Minh Trail loaded with cases of plastic vials, and heroin-crazed North Vietnamese regulars making suicide charges up the slopes of Khe Sanh with syringes stuck in their arms. However, the U.S. Army Provost Marshal laid such rumors to rest in a 1971 report, which said in part, "The opium-growing areas of North Vietnam are concentrated in the mountainous northern provinces bordering China. Cultivation is closely controlled by the government, and none of the crop is believed to be channeled illicitly into international markets. Much of it is probably converted into morphine and used for medical purposes." Instead, the Provost Marshal accused high-ranking members of South Vietnam's government of being the top zone in a four-tiered heroin-pushing pyramid. Zone 1, located at the top or the apex of the pyramid, contains the financiers or backers of the illicit drug traffic in all of its forms. The people comprising this group may be high-level, influential political figures, government leaders, or moneyed ethnic Chinese members of the criminal syndicates now flourishing in the Cholon sector of the city of Saigon. The members comprising this group are the powers behind the scenes who can manipulate, foster, protect, and promote the illicit traffic in drugs. But why were these powerful South Vietnamese officials, the very people who would lose the most if the heroin plague forced the U.S. Army to pull out of South Vietnam completely, promoting and protecting the heroin traffic? The answer was $88 million. Conservatively estimated, each one of the 20,000 or so GI addicts in Vietnam spend an average of $12 a day on 4 vials of heroin. Over a year, this came out to $88 million, a substantial amount of money in an impoverished, war-torn country. Let me tell you that while the South Vietnamese officer cadre and political figures such as Marshal Key and Prime Minister Tu were absolutely involved through their family members in the heroin traffic, it was not just the South Vietnamese officers and financiers who were involved in the heroin traffic. It was United States military officers also, and people in the United States who were backing the flow of heroin. It was the Corsican smugglers who had started the opium market before while the French were here. All of this international drug cartel was in full operation by the time I got to Vietnam. And a lot of American GIs came home addicted to heroin. And the amount of people addicted to heroin was easily 40% at the time that I left Vietnam in 1971. And people who were addicted to heroin were given a drug test before they left. They were detoxed for 2 or 3 weeks in country, and then they were dropped back on the streets with a Chapter 10 undesirable discharge or a less than honorable discharge, and tried to find their way back into society. These are your lost soldiers, ladies and gentlemen. And those lost soldiers are still with us today. And this same scenario is being worked out in Afghanistan and in Iraq, too. Afghanistan is now one of the prime producers of opium and heroin in the world. I'm going to read you something on a personal level of the way it affected GIs coming home from Vietnam. This is a book written by Dr. Jonathan Shea called Odysseus in America. It's a sequel to his first book, Achilles in Vietnam. He was a psychologist and medical doctor who worked with combat veterans of Vietnam at the VA up in Boston. And he wrote these books after becoming so involved in the lives of these veterans that he felt it incumbent on him to reveal some of the things that were going on in their spiritual breakdown and their physiological breakdown that ended up in addiction and suicide. The modern world has its own quest of truth, masters of truth, some of them very public and visible, like judges and broadcast media communicators. Others are faceless, anonymous bureaucrats who adjudicate veterans' disability claims. Doc, both a conventional nickname for a medic and here a pseudonym, was one of the 2 suicides on my watch during the 14 years I have been the psychiatrist for our specialized intensive outpatient treatment program for Vietnam combat veterans with PTSD. Doc volunteered for the U.S. Army in 1964 and trained at Fort Sam Houston as a medical corpsman. He then served in Germany and upon re-enlistment in 1967, volunteered for duty in Vietnam. Doc arrived in Vietnam in June of 1967, and this was when the war was progressively growing, and was assigned to the Military Assistance Command as a medical advisor, based in a military compound in Hue City. The 5-man advisory unit traveled with an ARVN, South Vietnamese Army unit, of up and down Highway 1 as far as the DMZ in the north and Phu Loc in the south. These movements along Highway 1 invited repeated ambushes and mortar attacks and mine explosions. The American advisory unit became extremely close-knit because they found that in a firefight the ARVN abandoned them and they could only rely on themselves. During one such ambush, 4 of the 5 men on the team were hit. 2 died immediately and 2 survived. But Doc, the only one not hit, felt then and until he killed himself that he should have kept his 2 dead buddies alive. The Tet Offensive started in Hue City on January 31st of 1968 with heavy rocket and mortar barrages followed by ground assaults on their compound within the city. At first light, the American soldiers in the compound could see numerous Viet Cong and NVA, North Vietnamese Army regulars flags surrounding it. The next 6 days, surrounded and cut off, they went utterly without sleep under constant rocket and mortar bombardment and repeated ground assault. The incoming rounds formed the content of Doc's hallucinatory reliving experiences, flashbacks triggered by firecrackers or other sharp, loud noises. 3 of the 5 U.S. medics in the compound were killed, 2 of them close friends. Doc recalled feeling overwhelmed by the numbers of casualties and his inability to evacuate them. In particular, he was torn up by the number who died under his care, who would have lived had it been possible to evacuate them. You see, in Vietnam, you had that golden hour in which a helicopter could have got you out and back to a medical base where you could have been at least stabilized. During the 6 days of encirclement before the Americans in the compound were relieved by the Marines, an episode happened that formed the basis of the veteran's most frequent, repetitive, traumatic dream. He was standing next to the captain when within a second both he and the captain were hit by bullets. Both went down together. The side of the captain's neck was ripped open and the blood spurted in Doc's face and drenched his shirt. Though wounded himself, he received the Purple Heart for this occasion. Doc carried on his duties as a medic. When the Marines broke through, he refused to be evacuated and accompanied a Marine unit whose medic had been killed. This led to 12 days of house-to-house combat as the Marines retook the city. There were heavy Marine casualties to whom Doc ministered under fire. He was present at the discovery of mass graves of those executed by the VC and the NVA. These masses of dead and mutilated bodies also figure in his repetitive nightmares. Doc was honored with 2 Bronze Stars, the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, and the Army Commendation Medal for Valor, in addition to receiving a Purple Heart and a Combat Medic Badge. Prior to Vietnam, Doc didn't drink, had never experimented with drugs, but after Tet, while still in the service, he became a heavy drinker and a steady user of marijuana and heroin, to shut out the grief and suppress flashbacks and nightmares. When he was honorably discharged from the Army in June of 1969, the year I enlisted, he was heavily addicted to alcohol and heroin. After discharge, Doc drifted from one menial job to another, holding and losing over 50 in 20 years. He married 3 times, each marriage ending because of PTSD and substance abuse. His self-medication of PTSD with alcohol, heroin, and then IV cocaine was partially successful, especially in controlling nightmares and flashbacks. Starting in 1975, he repeatedly sought treatment with numerous hospitalizations and detox. On every occasion, withdrawal from alcohol and drugs was followed by a resurgence of PTSD symptoms. After completion of the most recent hospital drug abuse treatment, starting in May of 1988, he was transferred to a psychiatry unit because of reemergence of PTSD symptoms. Previously, he had been discharged with no PTSD treatment symptoms. Previously, he had been discharged with no PTSD treatment, only further drug abuse treatment. He was discharged from the psychiatry unit ward to a halfway house and referred to our specialized outpatient combat PTSD program. Following this final hospital admission, Doc remained sober and clean for the next 3 years until a single fatal heroin overdose shortly after his claim for disability pension for combat PTSD was rejected. The coroner signed off the overdose death as accidental, but I believe Doc was too sophisticated both as a heroin addict and as a paramedic not to know that he had lost his drug tolerance during the long period of abstinence. His normal dose as a hardcore daily IV heroin addict was a lethal dose to the recovered addict without a tolerance. I believe he intentionally killed himself in despair, anger, and humiliation after the value of his service was, in his eyes, officially rejected by the VA. The masters of truth in the government bureaucracy followed objective procedures and observed objective criteria that led them to conclude that he had been disabled by his own willful misconduct of drug and alcohol abuse, not by psychological injury in the line of duty in service to his country and fellow soldiers. Whereas Link died figuratively for a few years in quest of his absolute truth, Doc literally died by his own hand in response to what he apparently experienced as others' possession of the absolute truth, that his war service had not injured him, only his own misbehavior. He was humiliated and dishonored by the official action. The masters of truth had found him unworthy. German veterans after the defeat in World War I who inhabited the absolute truth of the Doxtos von Hinten, the stab in the back by traitors inside the government and the army, were willing to kill someone who said that Germany had been beaten fair and square by the British, the French, and their late-coming allies, the Americans. They felt personally attacked and dishonored by this suggestion that they had been bested rather than betrayed. Dishonor arouses the desire to kill, self or others, sometimes both. Honor and dishonor are social processes which declares the truth of a person's or group's worth. What kind of truth is it that induces an addict's craving for it when absent, as if for cocaine, and produces an arrogant, violent, paranoid state when possessed? I wish I could answer this question. It goes to the heart of extremist religious and political movements. We can recognize the lethal intoxication with absolute truth in Timothy McVeigh, Osama bin Laden, and Jewish law student Yigael Amir, the assassin of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Veterans' tragic experiences render their own reckonings of ultimate truth and worth so very hard for them and so explosive. People will kill for it and will die for it, as the metaphor of the bodies moldering in the siren's meadow shows. Dr. Shays, who I was lucky enough to communicate with, would often say that he was kidnapped by the veterans. And he didn't mean that the veterans harmed him. He meant that he was kidnapped by their love of him for what he was trying to do. I wrote him an email in which I said, Dr. Shea, I've written you before. I am the Vietnam vet with the website Vera and the article on violence and cognitive dissonance. I was at South Windsor High School last Tuesday talking about media and my experience as a combat medic in Vietnam. I showed them old Polaroid photos and read them books, including Achilles in Vietnam. My soul is weeping after what I saw in Iraq on Wednesday. I know we will further damage ourselves as my brothers in arms will be seduced by the evil to get some. I told the 10th graders I spoke the entire class of 380 in day-long workshops about some of the things we did in Vietnam.